After years of speculation and controversy, Obama officially creates the Bears Ears National Monument. Utah Republicans staunchly oppose the designation. Can they do anything to reverse it? Will the court ultimately have to weigh in? And how are Utahns reacting? Tonight on the Hinckley Report, the 115th Congress is sworn in, but off to a rocky start. An attempt to gut the House Ethics Committee is rebuffed by President-elect Trump via Twitter. How did Utah's delegation vote? Obama calls on Democrats to preserve the Affordable Care Act. What will happen to this cornerstone of his legacy? In Utah, state leaders are sworn in amid a winter storm. What legislation is on the docket for 2017? How are Utahns responding to issues ranging from education funding to homelessness? And what are they saying about the public outcry over the locations of the new homeless shelters? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I am Jason Perry, director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Judy Faze, reporter with KUER, Damon Ken, associate professor of political science at Utah State University, and Glenn Mills, chief political correspondent with ABC4 News. So glad to have you all here. Let's first talk about a federal act that has huge implications on the state of Utah. Just this last week, President Obama declared the Bears Ears National Monument, 1.35 million acres inside the state of Utah, and it has become very controversial, even before the designation happened. Judy, talk about why that is.
Well, it seems as though the area has been under consideration. It's been mentioned as a place that warranted protection for over 80 years. I've heard a variety of numbers about how many archaeological artifact sites there are there, ruins and middens, places where the sort of story of ancient civilization was playing out for hundreds of years. And those areas were recognized back in, I want to say, the 30s. So fast forward to the last few years, and I think at the beginning of the Obama administration, this area was included in a list of possible monument designations. And I think seeing that, perhaps the delegation said, well, maybe we should see if we can work this out before the Antiquities Act is used by the president. And so there's been a lot of discussion over the last 2 years in particular as Congressman Bishop's Public Lands Initiative has been explored. That involved a lot of meetings, 7 counties, 18 million acres. The Utah Designates put forward a plan that would preserve 1.9 million acres in southeastern Utah, outside of the reservation and outside of the mining lands in San Juan County. And the administration, I think, explored both proposals when it came down to southern Utah in the center in July. And now I think the monument embodies the same acreage, a lot of the same acreage that the PLI did. The process was different, but the
yeah, let's talk about the process. Maybe Glenn, you get to this for a second. Very, very insightful there. So if we've been talking about this for a long time, and really we have polled people in the state of Utah and they feel like we should protect a lot of these areas. So what is the problem then? If it is similar in size, similar in terms of what we're going to protect, what is
Well, a couple things. First, the usage is different from the PLI and the designation of a monument. Second, a lot of members of Utah's congressional delegation, the governor, others that I've been talking to, feel like this is a parting shot from the president at the state of Utah. Utahns do not like the federal government controlling their land. Here in the state of Utah, about 66%, 2/3 of our public lands are under federal control. They don't like that. People think that local governments, people here think that local governments, those closest to the situation, are the ones best equipped to manage it. And that's why we see such a political fight over this here in the state of Utah.
Senator Hatch said that this was an attack on our way of life here in the West. And Damon, maybe you have a thought about that. There's this historical kind of conflict between us here in the West and the people back east on these kinds of designations. Is this just a process problem? Is it a political problem, or is it a legal problem?
I think it's all of the above. We've got a situation where people feel like they were not a part of a process. Congressman Bishop has been trying to bring people in and working on the Public Lands Initiative for years as a collaborative process. When a president exercises authority under the Antiquities Act to unilaterally declare a national monument, you end up with a situation where it feels like it was fait accompli from the time it was first discussed.
Is that the biggest problem, do you think?
I think that the big problem is everyone involved feels like their opinion should be heard the best or the most completely. And so I was wondering, and when you were talking about the change in uses, how is it going to change? How do we know how the use of the land would actually change? Because all of that is actually under federal control already.
Well, under the PLI, it creates a balance between lands that will be preserved and lands that could potentially be developed. So if that's one way that that's the biggest way that it would have changed under the PLI. And again, it goes back to this notion here in the state of Utah that we don't like, people in the state of Utah don't like the federal government telling us how to best manage our lands. And that's at the core of the political discussion here.
So you've interviewed, I think, most of our congressional delegation about this, Glenn. So why are they saying that? What is their biggest argument in opposition to this?
Well, what's the biggest battle cry you hear from our delegation is, one, President Obama's never stepped foot on Bears Ears. He made this decision from the executive office to designate it a monument. And of course, he sent people here. Secretary Jewell has been here and others. But that's one thing that really bothers people here in the state of Utah is that he's never stepped foot on the land in Bears Ears, and he designated it as a monument.
So what's next, Judy? How let's say our congressional delegation remains opposed, as does our Attorney General, as does our governor. What's next? What are the processes to challenge this?
It's funny because in a way you want to say, well, we're going into uncharted territory, but it's actually been charted. There have been cases, including involving the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument. And we have this new administration, and so many of the things that we thought we knew about how politics happens have changed in this last year. So I think it's a really valid question to see whether what happened before is going to happen again, and the Antiquities Act and the power of the president is going to be held up, or no.
I think one of the things to watch here is how is President-elect Donald Trump going to react to this once he takes office. We know that Senator Lee has had discussions with Trump, and also Representative Bishop has on this very issue. So I think that probably is the wild card and the X factor. How is Trump going to respond to this? And then all of the other issues that you mentioned, whether they be legislative or legal, will kind of fall into place after we find out what Trump decides to do.
But again, talking about precedent, a president has never undone another Antiquities Act decision.
But if there were ever a president that would take that step, isn't this the one that would at least look into doing that?
Right, and there is no explicit, Congress created the Antiquities Act to give the president that power. So it's interesting.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
To see whether Congress is going to change its mind or not. And again, that whole issue about the overlap between what was in the PLI and what's in the final designation for the monument, they're so close. How can the Utah delegation go up to the rest of Congress and say, you need to repeal this because we didn't get what we wanted? Because the fact is that the land is totally overlapped.
Substantially the same,
exactly,
is what you would say. So for Donald Trump in these conversations, and it's true as you described, the Antiquities Act gives the president some power to expand or contract, but not to remove the designation at all.
Right.
So do you think that's where our congressional delegation goes first, Damon?
Well, I don't think that trying to get Congress to reverse the Antiquities Act is the place where they're going to start. I think what you've got it really is a question about what a president can do. You can contract the monument, and President Trump might take that kind of a course of action to reduce the scope. Through administrative action, the president may be able to change what the rules and restrictions are on uses of the land and say, sure, okay, it can be a national monument, but we're going to allow motorized vehicle access in these sorts of ways. We'll allow grazing in these sorts of ways, and to change what exactly it means to be a national monument in terms of being more expansive in the types of uses that are allowed on that land.
I think one thing we can definitely count on for sure is that they're going to exhaust every single measure they can to try to get this reversed. They're dedicated to it. You brought up how long will they stay against it. The answer is they're going to be resolute in it, and they are going to stand against it for as much as they can and try everything that they can.
And do you think it's because that's the political thing to do in the state of Utah, where we're so concerned about the feds reaching in? Or is
I mean, obviously there is politics behind it, but if you take a look at our delegation, I think they truly believe that as part of their core value as well, is that the federal government has too much control in the state of Utah. And obviously on the campaign trail, this was a huge item on the campaign trail, the Bears Ears National Monument. We all knew it was coming, and in every single statewide race, congressional race, or the governor's race anyway, for the statewide, it was an issue on the campaign trail and in debates.
Just one final piece on this, and Damon, maybe you talk about this first, and then to you, Judy. So San Juan County, the commissioners there are quite concerned about it. A huge portion of that county is already under federal control in some way. Their ability to use some of that land has been curtailed. How do they approach that from a very local level?
This is a calamity in many ways for San Juan County. You've got over 90% of the land in that county that's going to be controlled by the federal government with some serious and invasive restrictions on what people can do with the land in their county. There's still issues unresolved with how this will affect education funding because of the massive amount of land. You can't tell me that there's another county anywhere in the country that wouldn't raise an objection to having the federal government control 90% of the land in their county.
A couple of points. One is, again, every single inch of what's in the monument was already controlled by the U.S. Forest Service and the BLM. So that federal management is always there. There isn't a land grab because there wasn't new land grabbed. What's changing is the management. And for the school children, under the Grand Staircase Escalante Monument, the Sitla land, where there's Sitla land in this monument as well, the Sitla land ended up being a boon for Sitla. They traded out their parcels, and I think the number is something like $50 million. They ended up getting a big, quick deal with the federal government on all this land that they couldn't have really gotten any benefit from otherwise. So I don't think we have a lot of answers. If you look at the proclamation that the president issued, which is on the White House webpage, it talks about the continued land uses. And so there's a difference between what we've heard and what's on there. And I think that it'll be interesting to see how the discussion goes compared with what the proclamation actually says. I don't think we know the answer is the bottom line.
A lot of unknowns still in this designation, right?
Well, and one thing we haven't talked much about yet, which is certainly still on the table, is legal action as well. Of course, we know last year the state legislature approved the land swap lawsuit right around $14 million. My understanding from talking to sources up on Utah's Capitol Hill is that these two issues will likely remain separate. That one will continue to go forward on its own, but we have already heard Attorney General Sean Reyes say that he is going to move forward with a lawsuit on the Bears Ears National Monument. He won't say anything about it. We cornered him at the Capitol on Monday after he was sworn into office, and he had no comment on it. But we do know that that's certainly an option that they are moving forward with.
There were 10 lawsuits on the Antiquities Act already that have played out. So this is not uncharted territory. Those lawsuits were decided in favor.
And another interesting factor is we have a vacancy. If this were to go to the Supreme Court, we have a vacancy that Mr. Trump will be filling, and that could play a key role in these types of lawsuits.
So let's talk more about Donald Trump for just a moment. Interesting poll this last week. 71% of Utahns said he should tweet less. Interestingly enough, 11% said tweet more. Wasn't any of you answering those questions, right? Yeah. You wanted more of those. I want to talk about these tweets this week in particular, particularly with our new office of elected officials coming in. They're about to be sworn in on Tuesday. Monday nights, the Republicans meet in conference committee, and they decide to abolish the Office of Congressional Ethics. Not abolish, I guess. Gut the Office of Congressional Ethics. Donald Trump puts out a tweet saying it's not right, but there are bigger issues than this. Can't believe we're doing that right now. 2 hours later, it's undone. What do you make of that first, Glenn? I guess people are reading his tweets.
Yeah, I think it was probably a deer in the headlights moment for a lot of our congressional members. I don't really know what they were thinking, to be honest with you. Perhaps they thought they could pass it through while no one was watching, sweep it under the rug, and nothing would come of it. But that was just not a good signal to get the 115th Congress started to the American people to do away with or gut this ethics committee. And I think a lot of them perhaps realized that after it started getting attention, and common sense prevailed, and it was reversed pretty much immediately.
Damon, what were they thinking? How is this the very first act of this brand new Congress?
It's simply a bad idea. The first thing you do when you come into office should never be to loosen the ethics restriction that confine you as an elected official. It's simply a lapse in judgment. Sometimes when you're used to being an elected official, I think it gets easy to start to think that a lot of people aren't paying attention, but you have to remember that someone is always paying attention when you are an elected official.
You're one that's paying attention.
Well, it's interesting for a couple of reasons. One is I think it talks about our times and the hunger for morality and ethics, I think, in government. And it's a little ironic, I would say, that we had President Trump, whose moral values and whose ethics have been sort of on the front page a lot in the last few months, basically calling Congress out on something like that. Even just the optics of it, what the reality of it maybe isn't even relevant.
That's a good point, because the optics were tough. I'm curious about a couple items, which is sort of the interplay of this new Congress, though, because we had the Speaker of the House, Paul Ryan, who was opposed to changing this office, and the Majority Leader McCarthy also. But they were sort of going to go with this decision until Monday morning, until these tweets. Are these groups talking, Damon? Do you think? Are they waiting for the tweet, or was Paul Ryan and Donald Trump talking about?
I don't know.
This decision.
Donald Trump sure comes out of the situation looking, well, presidential, which is something that for some people is a little shocking.
So he put out a tweet that you maybe agreed with.
The fact that it was all done on Twitter, though, right?
I mean, that was less than presidential, sure.
Isn't that interesting, the world we live in now, that we're reporting on our President of the United States based on things he's tweeting, as opposed to what he's not holding press conferences, and that brings in a whole new level of danger, in my opinion. Take, for example, remember when he got us all riled up here in the state of Utah over the F-35 program? We had no chance to ask follow-up questions like, well, what do you mean about this? We just had this tweet come out that it's spending too much money and we need to cut back on it. But nobody knew what he really meant. And that's what the danger that we're going into with this Twitter president by using social media to get out all of his ideas and comments, as opposed to taking questions from reporters and follow-up questions.
So Judy, I know you follow these very closely. So let's just say, because there are two tweets that came out about this ethics office that maybe caused the change of heart. I'm not sure. But we even had Democrats in the state of Utah saying, wow, those are some tweets I agree with. But as a member of the press, did that add any comfort level to you that he's monitoring and stepping in, or are you just as concerned that there's no interchange with the media?
I think that excluding the media is really a hazard, and I'm interested in seeing how this plays out over the next couple of months. I've been to a number of Republican national conventions, and they're impressive for how organized they are. But I mean, just look at that one move you're talking about out of the gate, and the tweet and the response I can't really see a lot of progress going forward if the party doesn't get its message together and that sort of thing. So it seems like we still really are working with a divided government, and without having reporters there to help people say, this is something to pay attention to, that's something to pay attention to, I think the public is going to be really left out of some important dialogue and information.
It kind of goes back to my point I made earlier about a president willing to take unprecedented moves. It's part of history and tradition for the president to travel with the press corps, and there's a reason that they've done that, so that they've had that check and balance system in place.
Well, let's talk about that check and balance just a little bit, because when it came to changing the ethics office, this was an office that both sides of the aisle had concerns about, and but in this case, it ended up being just the Republicans taking the heat on it, even though there were a bunch of Democrats there. Nancy Pelosi weighing in a serious way. Is this one of those issues that's showing it's becoming even more divided than before, Damon? Or you watch this very closely. Is there any sense of unification in this Congress, or is it as divided as we've seen in the past?
I think it's going to be as divided as we've seen, and then only escalate. And the divisions could be a little bit different this time, though, because not only do you have the classic divisions between Republican and Democrat that are as polarized as they've ever been in U.S. history, but you've also got some interesting differences within the Republican Party and within the Democratic Party. And I think what we saw with the ethics issue is a very factionalized, divided Republican Party that's having a hard time getting together to speak with a single voice, and that could make things plunge to new lows for congressional dysfunctionality.
Really quickly, before we leave that, maybe you can talk about that dysfunction a little bit as it relates to Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, because we saw the Democrats go out with Obama this week saying, preserve my legacy, preserve this piece, and they got the Republicans saying, no, we are getting rid of this. What are you hearing there just in less than 1 minute?
Okay, so right now, both sides are meeting together, rallying the troops, trying to do everything they can to, on the Republican side, repeal it, and on the Democrat side, restore it and keep it in place. What we're hearing, I mean, the Republicans are absolutely bound on getting it repealed, but they do know one thing. They cannot push this through on a straight party vote. That was the major problem and cause of the controversy with the original Affordable Care Act, that it did not receive one vote from the other party. So I think Republicans absolutely understand they have to get some Democratic support on this repeal plan, replacement plan that they come up with. And I'm sure we are going to see more of a bipartisan move on that issue as far as healthcare is concerned.
Let's turn to a very local issue for us, because it's been very, very kind of controversial in the state of Utah on homelessness. Our Salt Lake City Council, our Mayor Jackie Biskupski, has unveiled this new plan for these 4 150-bed facilities here in the state of Utah, and the process was what people are going after. Maybe Judy, take just a second as to why this issue is so hot right now in the state of Utah, and a little bit about the process that we got to these new facilities.
It seems like people are really uncertain about what the future looks like. They've been told that this is the plan. We've chosen the sites, and we have a whole new way of doing this. But there's really nothing to compare it to. So the administration has little to tell people about what their neighborhoods would look like. How can they prevent Pioneer Park from happening in 5 different locations in the city? And so I think the uncertainty, there's been some, I think, recognition by the Biskupski administration that they might have done a better job selling their plan. And I don't know that they really have data and information that will make people feel more comfortable.
What do you think, Glenn? You were following this closely. You've talked to all these officials.
Well, another part of the process that really has people upset is that they didn't have a voice leading up to the selection, right? Four sites were selected, and they were basically said, these are going to be the sites. You have no say in that. You can only help pick the colors, so to speak. And people were really frustrated about that. And, I'm hearing a lot of pushback from even members of the city council. They thought that there could have been a more transparent process in allowing people's voices to be heard within the city. Like, for example, select 8 sites and let the public weigh in on those 8 sites, and then narrow it down based on that feedback to 4. Really, we're seeing the most contention around the Simpson Ave location in Sugar House, and that makes sense because that's the one that's sitting right in the middle of a residential neighborhood, right?
So you think if the process was done better, maybe more sites were put forward and you could vote on those, you think that would have fixed this? I'm going to get to the outside perspective in just a second, Damon, too, but would that have fixed this problem we're having right now? Or is it just about people not wanting it in their backyard?
I don't know the answer to that, because frankly, I don't know how you put a facility that promises outsiders into your neighborhood. I don't know how you make that sell sell that to anyone. We've heard from some people who aren't very concerned about it, who already are living with some level of homelessness in their midst. To me, I think one of the really interesting themes of this whole conversation is I want a voice. I want to be heard. I want the decisions that are made by our leaders to include my point of view, to have accounted for what I say. And I think that that's maybe the challenge of our time politically, is to get to the point where we can integrate opinions and also actually get stuff done.
To answer your question, I think no matter where it ends up, there are going to be people that are upset about it.
Absolutely.
But at least there's this perception anyway of some transparency in listening to the people that are going to be impacted the most by it. And I think that could calm some of the nerves and disappointment out there right now, as if at least the process would have included them. I mean, the prison is a great example of that, right? No matter where it would have gone, people were going to be upset about it, but there was a very big debate about it across the state, and people at least felt like they had an opportunity to voice their opposition.
Sounds like a great message in all of this. The process does matter in these things. Damon, you've been following this from Cache Valley too, this issue. What is the perception of this problem outside of the Wasatch Front? You know, because we talk about this a lot here. What are people saying outside?
Off the Wasatch Front, people don't think about homelessness very much because we don't see as much of it. I think there's two reasons for that. One is that off the Wasatch Front, we have smaller communities, tighter communities, and people sometimes tend to have a belief that the issue of homelessness can be solved through charitable action, through strong neighborhoods, strong families, and strong communities. And I think part of the reason why there's a smaller homelessness problem outside the Wasatch Front is because of those reasons. But the Cache Valley solution for homelessness is to buy a bus ticket to Salt Lake City, and that's only going to feed the problems that Salt Lake is facing, rather than solve the problems being faced here on homelessness.
Okay. This is an issue that is going to continue to go forward, and I'm hopeful that you all are continue to be part of that process as well. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you.
That's it for the Hinckley Report. For more political analysis and the news of the week, please check out our Hinckley Report Web Extra online. We'll see you next week. Thank you and good night.